Hello everyone, welcome to CS350. This is Karthik Gopalan. In this lecture, we'll talk about operating systems and its relation to computer security. Let's first begin by defining what we mean by security. Security of any computer system is defined by three properties, which are summarized by the initial CIA. C stands for confidentiality, I stands for integrity, and A stands for availability. By confidentiality, we mean that if you have any personal data, then you don't want the data to be stolen by or accessed by unauthorized parties. By integrity, we mean that the data belonging to regular users should not be tampered with by malicious users. And finally, by system availability, we mean that the computer system should and its services should be available to regular users, and the availability should not be affected by attacks on the system. So we also want to consider various models of security. So by this we mean when we are securing a computer system, we have to be very specific about what we are securing and from whom. For example, you might want to secure the operating system from users. Normally in a system, operating system is considered the most privileged piece of software. So if operating system is compromised, then the entire system is compromised. Hence, we want to ensure that the operating system is fully protected from attacks by non-privileged users of the system. Next, you might want to protect one user from another user in the system. We do this by means of enforcing access control and isolation among the users. For example, different users have their own file system, directories, files, and so on. Different users, when they run their process have their own address spaces. And operating system's role is to enforce the isolation across users and their processes. Sometimes you also want to secure users of a system from the operating system. Sometimes the operating system itself may not be trusted by the users. This is commonly the case when you execute your applications on third-party platforms such as cloud platforms. Here, the cloud platform may be an untrusted party, and users may be just using the computation resources available in the cloud. So in this case, users may be worried about their confidential data being leaked to the operating system of the cloud. In this case, you may want some mechanisms to protect the user's data from the operating system. So there are certain operating system security mechanisms that we have already learned in this class. These relate to the CPU, the memory, and the file systems. When we consider CPU, we are talking about CPU execution privileges, which determines who can access what. So, uh, so CPU execution privileges consist of privilege levels defined by the instruction set architecture. For example, in x86, you have four privilege levels 0, 1, 2, and 3. Operating system usually executes at level 0, which is the most privileged level, and user applications run at privilege level 3, which is the least privileged level. These privilege levels are encoded in a special register called the eFlags register, in which two of the bits represent the privilege level of the currently executing code. If operating system is executing, then the two bits are marked as 0. And if the user applications are executing, then the two bits would be 3. In addition, if you are looking at virtualization technology, then Intel adds additional privileged modes called root and non-root mode. In the root mode, the hypervisor gets to execute, and in the non-root mode, the virtual machines get to execute. When we consider memory protection, then there are certain privilege bits embedded in in both the page tables and in segment descriptors, and these bits determine who can access certain memory locations. So in particular, there are protection bits embedded in every segment. So an operating system's data would be in segments that are marked with operating systems privileges, and user level applications will have their data in segments that are marked with user application privileges. So memory protection and CPU execution privileges go hand in hand. For example, if a program is executing with certain CPU privileges, then in order to access a piece of memory, its CPU privileges must match with the memory privileges embedded in the segment descriptor and the page tables. So every memory access that's performed during the execution of a program would be enforced by the execution hardware. uh, the execution hardware will match the CPU execution privilege level and the memory protection privilege level before allowing memory access. In addition, when we talked about file systems, we discussed how different users can have their own directories with appropriate permissions. So file systems define user accounts, and also they often define access permissions for different users. So what are some of the common motivations for intruders of a computer system? You might have the Peeping Tom case where there might be casual prying by non-technical users. So if you leave certain sensitive files exposed with inappropriate file permissions, then other users may be able to view those files, even though they are not actively trying to um, attack your system. There is the question of insider threat, in which some inside employees of an organization may be disgruntled, and in the process, they might hijack the organization's computer system. For example, programmers might install backdoors in the source code so that they can access those backdoors in case they are fired. Some people uh, intrude into computer systems for extortion. So in this case, someone might inject malicious code into an organization and then demand payment in order to as a threat to the organization to prevent any damage. So finally, governments might engage in espionage or intelligence gathering, and hacking computer systems is an active part of that effort. Sometimes political and social motivations may motivate certain people to hack computer systems. We hear about this all the time in news, where different social causes uh, prompt some groups to hack certain computer systems. And sometimes some of these motivations may overlap. A key part of computer security is user authentication. Authentication means to verify that users of a system are who they claim they are. So this is very important to establish the identity of a user in order to grant appropriate permissions to the user. For example, there may be file permissions that are set according to the user's identity. Some of the basic ways in which authenticity of a user is established is by means of either something the user knows, or something the user has, or something the user is. Uh, so we'll see examples of each of these in the subsequent slides. Something the user knows. An example of this, most common example, is the use of passwords. Passwords are universally used to authenticate a user. The assumption is that if a user knows a certain password, then he is the person who claims to be. So you normally, when you log into a system, you enter your username and your password, and a successful login indicates that that you are the person who you claim to be. Uh, so one of the key things to consider when using passwords is how the passwords are stored. In many earlier systems, passwords were stored in a plain text in a file. So when a user entered a password, the password file will be looked up, the password would be compared as a string, and the user would be allowed or disallowed access. But but the location of the password file had to be secure. The assumption was that as long as the permissions of the uh, password file were set to be confidential, nobody else would be able to gain access to the system in an unauthorized way. There were two problems with the approach. One was that if the password file is lost, then the entire security of the computer is compromised. Secondly, users may not want to reveal their passwords even to the system administrator. So there we needed a way in which you could allow users to enter their passwords without revealing their passwords to third parties, including system administrators. One way to do that was to encrypt or hash the passwords. There are many one-way hash functions in which if you take a password and apply the hash function, then you get a corresponding hash value, which can then be compared for authenticated access. But if you knew the hash value, you could not easily generate the password using a reverse function. So this one-way hash functions allow adequate privacy as well as security for most computer systems. Another approach is challenge response authentication. Oftentimes, users forget their passwords. So in order for users to get access to their accounts, most systems allow a challenge response system where you might be posed certain security questions, and if you know the answers to the security questions, then you are allowed access. You're allowed to reset your password. Often the security questions are like additional levels of passwords, and the same type of precaution should be observed with security questions and their answers as you do with password files. So sometimes instead of security questions, you may be asked to compute something that only you know, such as multiplying your birth year by a certain number and giving the answer. Another way of establishing authenticity is by using physical objects. So, for example, users may be assigned a smart card, and smart card may have a certain chip that, when inserted into the computer, would communicate with a remote computer and then establish authenticity of the user. Here, the assumption is that if the user has a smart card, then he is the authorized person. And in addition to just having a physical object, user may be asked to enter a password as an additional level of security. Thus, the presence of both the smart card and knowing the password together establish the authenticity of the user. And the third approach is to use some specific properties of the user himself. These include things like biometrics. For example, voice recognition systems may recognize a user's voice. Face recognition systems may look at the features of a face. Fingerprint recognition systems look for fingerprints. Iris scans look for signatures in the eye. The style of typing can determine whether this is a user is the one who claims to be. So for all of these approaches, there are false positives and false negatives. And sometimes some of these techniques may be susceptible to spoofing, where one user may pretend to be someone else. So often biometrics these days use a combination of these approaches. So you might use voice recognition along with face recognition to authenticate somebody. There are lots of countermeasures against authentication attacks. If someone is trying to guess the password, then you can limit the number of times a user uh, can can enter the password, or you can use two-factor authentications. For example, you might ask the user to enter a password, plus you might send a text message with a specific code to a phone number that the user owns. You might log all the system activity. So logging means that you keep a record of all the system activity, so that in case the uh, user's account is hacked, you might be able to inform the real user through an email or a phone call about such activity. Um, some systems use CAPTCHA to differentiate automated hacking attempts from legitimate users. CAPTCHA is called completely automated public Turing test to tell computers and humans apart. These usually consist of certain images that a human user should be able to read and reproduce. Um, so by using CAPTCHAs, you can increase the security of authentication mechanisms. And finally, certain systems may use honeypot accounts as a trap for illegal users. So if you're interested in not just preventing invalid attempts, but also to catch the bad guys, then you might create a fake user account, and anyone trying to log into those fake accounts would be flagged as malicious. Common attacks and countermeasures. So some of the common attacks on computer systems involve Trojan horses. For example, so this refers to malicious code that might be injected into either uh, legitimate programs or into documents that the users are using. So, for example, email attachments that you receive by email may often contain malicious code, and if you execute those documents, if you open those documents, then the malicious code executes and compromises your computer. Similarly, if you visit certain websites that are compromised, then they might inject code into your computer through the web browser. Web browsers often have active content such as Flash plugins, JavaScripts, and so on, which affect the user, which can inject malicious code into your computer. So you can turn off these active components, but then that affects the usability of your web browser. There are also free programs available on the web, especially for mobile devices through application marketplaces. And when you download and run this code, then again your computer can be compromised. So a countermeasure is to either run the applications in a virtual machine or not to download them in the first place. Finally, most hacking attempts would try to replace legitimate utility programs with altered versions. For example, /bin/ls, which lists the contents of your file, may be replaced with a version that actually compromises your computer. So, a countermeasure for this is that administrators should strictly monitor the uh, permissions of all the legitimate utility files that are used by the users. Viruses and worms are two commonly accepted threats to computer systems. Viruses refer to programs that reproduce themselves by attaching their code to another program or to another document. So, when you execute the program or open the document, then the virus takes over the computer. In order for a virus to spread from one computer to another, it requires human intervention, which means that a human being should either download the file or should carry the infected program physically, such as using a USB device to another computer. Worms, on the other hand, although they are just like viruses in that they infect a computer, they spread automatically. They would scan the network for other computers that are vulnerable, and they would have code to inject themselves into remote computers and spread without human assistance. Login spoofing refers to an authentication attack where a legitimate login screen might be replaced with a fake one. So when a user tries to log into a fake login screen, then the attacker would capture the password of the user and may return an invalid login attempt. A countermeasure for login spoofing is called trusted path. A trusted path is a certain sequence of user actions, such as certain uh, key combinations that the user must press, which, when the action is taken, then it's guaranteed to give control of the computer to the operating system. For example, when you commonly log into Windows machines, it might ask you to press Ctrl Alt Delete, and this key sequence is guaranteed to give control to the operating system, which would then present you with a legitimate login screen. So this is a trusted path. The effectiveness of this mechanism, it depends upon users knowing that there is a trusted key sequence that they should employ in order to perform a legitimate login. Logic bombs are like Trojan horses uh, that may be uh, latent in a computer system, and they may be triggered by an attacker at a time of his choosing. For example, a programmer in a company might write a logic bomb, which would not do any harm as long as the programmer enters his password every day. But if the programmer is fired and he doesn't enter the password, then the logic bomb can erase the erase the sensitive information belonging to the company. However, these types of attacks are usually anticipated by organizations, and they are also easy to detect. Uh, Buffer overflow attack is a very common type of attack on a computer system where which usually results from sloppy code writing. So oftentimes programs use arrays or buffers, and sometimes programmers are not careful enough to perform bounds check, which means that if an external input is received, then the programmer must check uh, the extent of memory that's being overwritten by the user's input. If the input extends beyond the end of the buffer, then it can overwrite return addresses from a function, and control can be transferred to malicious code, which can then compromise the computer. So there are various types of countermeasures uh, for buffer overflow attacks, and these usually involves either protecting the return address, or they may involve detecting when a buffer overflow attack happens. Memory reuse is another commonly employed technique to steal users' data. So in this type of attack, um, uh, normally an attacker would constantly allocate memory and try to read the allocated memory for sensitive information. For example, when you do malloc and free operations, free doesn't completely erase the memory being returned back to the computer system. So there is if the operating system does not scrub the memory that is returned back, then the same memory may be reallocated to another user who can then read sensitive information from those buffers. Scrubbing is usually expensive because it involves zeroing out the contents of the memory. So some operating systems would perform scrubbing only when there are sensitive applications involved. Logging is a commonly used technique to keep track of all the activity in a computer system. So if a malicious attack happens, then you can look at the system logs to determine what happened, and to track back the attacker. But logging has its own cost. For example, log takes up time and space. Committing data to the disk may take certain amount of time, which can slow down the normal operations of the system. It also takes up storage. So if you log too much information, then the logs can grow quickly in size and overwhelm the disk. If you log too little information, then you may miss critical events. So logging just the right amount of information is very important, and it's also a very delicate decision. So a common form of attack may be that an attacker may overwhelm the logging system with spurious events that can cause the log system to overflow. And once the logging is disabled in some manner, then the attacker can compromise the system. Also, one of the first things that an attacker does after compromising a system is to go back and erase the system logs to hide their tracks. So logging is not a foolproof way of detecting system events unless the logs are completely protected. There are other ways to gain access. For example, a user may just try privileged system calls to see what happens. So if a privileged system call is not properly implemented, then this can potentially expose holes in the system. In addition, if there is a list of things that the users must not do, then the attacker may specifically try to do those things in order to see if there is a potential hole in the system. Or you might use social engineering attacks. For example, you can convince a programmer to insert a backdoor into a computer system. There are certain design principles of computer security. For example, the default permissions for accessing a system should be no access unless the user provides sufficient authentication. You should also always check for the current authority of the user to access certain resources, such as files. You should always make sure the authority information is up to date and not cached in any manner. You should give each process the least possible privilege, so which means that unnecessary privileges should not be provided to any component of the system. uh, the protection mechanism should be simple, uniform. They should be implemented at the lowest possible layers of the software stack, or even the hardware system. Uh, and security system should be simple and acceptable to the users. If the security system is too complex, then users may find ways to get around that security mechanism. Sandboxes are isolated execution environments in which a user can execute untrusted programs. For example, if you download a piece of code from the internet, and you might not trust it, then you can start a virtual machine or a container, also called a jail, in which you can execute the untrusted program. You can use such sandboxes to isolate worms, viruses, or trojans, so that if any potential harm is done, it is contained within the sandbox and rest of the system outside is not affected. However, people always devise ways to get around sandboxes. For example, there are VM escapes or jailbreaks in which a malicious code may detect that it is running within an isolated environment and try to find ways to bypass the restrictions. Access control refers to the set of rules that allow or disallow access to a certain resource in the system. There are various types of access control mechanisms. For example, discretionary access control is the most commonly applied access control mechanism in commodity systems. Here, you might assign certain permissions to certain users. For example, John can access a certain resource X, Alice can do certain actions Y, and so on. So it's called discretionary because the specification of the rules is at the discretion of the system administrator, and the system administrator can decide who gets access to which resources. Mandatory access controls are used in more sensitive systems such as military, defense, or national security systems. Here, the idea is that the security mechanisms are built into the computer system, and even the system administrator does not have the ability to bypass these controls. Hence, these are called mandatory. We will have more information on mandatory access control in later slides. Finally, role based access controls associate certain permissions with roles of certain users rather than individual users. For example, role based access control may say that CEO can do certain actions, an engineer can do certain actions, and a secretary can do certain actions. So, even though the specific people filling these roles may change, for example, you might have a different CEO or a software engineer and so on at different times, the permissions associated with those roles remain the same, and uh, this allows for better system manageability. Finally, administrative role-based access control uh, uh, refers to uh, refers to who can set the permissions for role-based access control. So, for example, you can say that dean can allow a department chair to do X, and department chair can allow some other staff member to do something else. Access control lists are another option besides discretionary access control. Here, instead of specifying traditional read, write, execute permissions with files, you might you might associate a list of users and what they can do with the file. For example, for file 1, you can specify that user A can read and write to it, whereas user B has the same permissions as user A. Uh, so access control lists are a little bit more expressive than the traditional discretionary access control, and many modern operating systems such as security enhanced Linux use access control lists. Capabilities specify uh, what actions each specific process can execute. So every process can have a certain capability list, and the operating system may enforce those capabilities during the execution of the process. Reference monitor and trusted computing base are two central concepts in operating systems. A reference monitor refers to the part of the operating system that enforces access control policies. So sometimes reference monitor is also called a security kernel. Trusted computing base refers to the part of the software system that is trusted by the user. By this, we mean that the users assume that the trusted computing base or the components of the trusted computing base are not compromised. Trusted does not mean that these systems are automatically secure. Trusted instead means that the users of the system rely on these components to be secure. So if the trusted computing base is compromised, then the entire computing system is assumed to be compromised. So again, trusted computing base is the part of the operating system that the users assume will remain secure against attacks. This may or may not be true, but users have basically no choice but to trust the trusted computing base. As a result, developers try to minimize the trusted computing base of a system. If your trusted computing base is small, then it's easier to verify that the trusted computing base is secure. If trusted computing base is very large, for example, it has millions of lines of code, then it's very hard for uh, any human or automated system to verify the security of the TCB. So minimal trusted computing base is usually correlates to a more secure system. Multi-level security is also called mandatory access control that we discussed earlier. Multi-level security is used in military defense and national security or systems. So in multi-level security, the goal is to keep the security mechanism simple and yet strong. So here you might have certain data objects that are classified at different security levels. For example, you might classify certain documents as top secret, secret, confidential, classified, or unclassified. And in addition, you might have sub classifications within these high level classifications. Besides that, people who have access to these data objects have some certain clearances to access these data objects. In order to access top secret documents, you need a top secret clearance. In order to access secret documents, you need to have secret clearance. So a person with top secret clearance may be able to access all documents, whereas a person with secret clearance can only access secret documents and lower level classified documents. So informally, to see a data object, you must have a clearance for that level or for that compartment. So there are two key properties for multi-level security systems. This is called no read up and no write down. So what that means is that so in this picture you have squares representing users and circles representing data. A user or an entity could either be a human being or even a computer system. So no read up refers to the property that a data object at a high security level should not be accessible or readable by an entity or a user at low security level, which means that data should not flow from a high security level to a user at a lower security clearance. At the same time, you also don't want a user at a high security level to pass data to lower security level. So there is no write down policy. So just because a person has a high security clearance doesn't mean you automatically trust that person. There are mechanisms in place to prevent people at high security clearance to leak data to lower security clearance. So no read up is somewhat intuitive, but no write down is not as intuitive, and special care should be taken to prevent no write down to enforce no write down policies. On the other hand, uh, you allow read down and write ups. What that means is that a person at a high security clearance should be able to read lower level security information, and a person at lower security clearance should be able to send data to a higher security clearance level. although they should not be allowed to tamper with data at a higher security clearance level. Finally, an MLS pump is a mechanism to enforce the no read up, no write down policy. So this the need for an MLS pump comes from the fact that if uh, a lower security clearance entity is able to send data to a higher security clearance level, there has to be some acknowledgement back. But the reverse acknowledgement channel should not be used for as a covert channel for sending for leaking data from the higher security clearance level. And MLS pump allows this by enables this by allowing allowing write ups, but making the write downs so slow that you cannot send any meaningful data back to the lower level. This brings us to the end of our discussion about computer security and operating systems. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me.